Welcome to the November 19th History Bites lecture sponsored by the Amherst Historical Society with help from our friends at Amherst Media. But my name is George Naughton. I'm the president of the Amherst Historical Society. And today our lecturer is Dr. Robert Weir, who's spoken to us once before, back in March of 2018, about Civil War monuments. Today, Dr. Weir is going to talk about his new book, Who Knew?, in which he brings his practiced eye to bear on a variety of local buildings, monuments, and markers. Dr. Weir holds a PhD in American history from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, formerly known as Mass Aggie. He's a former Fulbright scholar. He's the author of numerous books and articles, and has recently retired from nearly 40 years of high school and university teaching. He now spends part of his retirement time wandering around UMass, well, wandering around Western Mass, in search of new marvels to share with the rest of us. So to talk about his book today, please welcome Dr. Robert Weir.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen in a second here. And I'm hoping that everybody sees a slide of the book cover, Who Knew? Roadside Revelations in Western Mass. So the only time today I'm actually going to read to you, as opposed to letting you read for yourself some of the slides that you're going to see, is right now. I'm going to read you just a section from the introduction to the book, which tells you a little bit about what this book is about and why I did it. So here we go. Who knew that an elaborate fountain in Lee, Massachusetts was part of a plot to wean citizens from the allure of demon rum? Why does a 20-foot concrete milk bottle sit on the front lawn of an elementary school in Whately? Did you know that one of the most influential visionaries in American history lived most of his life in Chicopee Falls? Whose crazy idea was it to build a sprawling fairy tale house in the Berkshire's hamlet of Tyringham? And who decided to associate Mohawk Indians with metal teepees with wooden doors? Who Knew? Roadside Revelations in Western Massachusetts tells the stories behind follies, oddities, and curiosities that folks stumble upon when they journey through the region. Many are things that many local residents no longer see and probably never knew much about in the first place. Commonplace things have a habit of sliding into the blurry background of our everyday routines. When Northampton friends ask me for an example of the book's contents, I often mention the monument on West Street. Invariably, they ask, what monument? Once you see it, it's pretty hard to miss. So that's kind of what my take on what's going on here. I wanted to do this book because it was fun. As an academic, I wrote some kind of weighty tomes in my time in academia. This one's kind of cheeky. A little puckish in places. I wanted to understand the why of things. As a historian, I always want to know why. So if we have unusual things, I always assumed that they are there for a reason. I want to do Western Mass because it's too often ignored. And I'll get into that a little bit here in a second. And then I want to give you folks a challenge of recovering some local history, some local Amherst history. So the agenda, which you can see over there, is I'm going to first start off about talking about what I call weird America in Western Mass, and then I'll give you a real quick CSI kit for doing local history. That's crime scene investigation, which was a show that used to be on TV. Maybe it still is, I don't know. And then we're going to take a visit to Lee, Massachusetts, and then we'll have conversation about what you've been seeing. But let's start off with something that's missing from view. Here's some old slides from courtesy of the Jones Library, by the way. And you see that there is a water fountain there. And I want to talk about that a little bit. It's still there, but it's boarded up. So I didn't write about it in the book because the book is about things you can actually see. So I'll talk about the one in Lee to talk about what might be done in Amherst. First, one of the questions I get all the time is, hey, Rob, why are you interested in these unusual, weird things? And the answer to that is I started young. That's my only defense. I grew up in Pennsylvania, South Central Pennsylvania, working class kid. We didn't travel very much, but we did take a 2.5-hour journey to Charlottesville, PA, down sort of near Allentown to visit Roadside America. And it fascinated me from the get-go. It's basically one of the world's largest train sets. But I wanted to ask the question why. Even as a kid, I asked the question, why is this all here? Why are there so many villages that represent America at different time periods? Well, obviously, it is a story about America. It talks about social change, and it's a romanticized view, of course. It talks about belief in community and the American ability to adapt to new technology. So I learned that as a little bit later on. It kind of dawned on me that's what this was all about. As I got older, I read this book that you see on your screen, In Small Things Forgotten. Reminded me that you can learn a lot from small things. And in chapter 26 of the book, I talk about something that's not much bigger than a Scrabble tile, which is actually a Pelham community token. So this is a local connection for you. And I digitally enhanced the P on there, which the P was from Pelham, although it was a communion token for the Presbyterian community up in Pelham. And it is, we learned an awful lot about what a disputatious place Pelham was. People agreed on everything except that agreement, pretty much. They didn't agree on much of anything up there is what I meant to say. Sorry, I kind of botched that explanation there. I also like big things. Now, America's a huge country. There are only 3 countries in the world which are larger than the United States. So naturally, we build things that are big. Another thing I saw when I was a kid was Lucy the Elephant in Margate, New Jersey. That's a section of Atlantic City. My aunt took me there. And I was fascinated by the fact that Lucy was a hotel. And then I thought, well, why is that there? And later I figured out that there were a lot of them, and they were all built about the time that P.T. Barnum brought Jumbo the Elephant to the United States from England. These things collectively are what the art historian Carol Ann Marlin calls the colossi of Rhodes, R-O-A-D-S. We have a lot of them in the United States. Paul Bunyan, obviously, is another one. I remember seeing that in Bangor, the original statue in Bangor. There's a newer one there now that tells a story about taming the American wilderness, and also tells a story about regional disputes, because everybody claims Paul Bunyan, it seems. Maine claims him, Minnesota claims him, Wisconsin claims him, Canada claims him. So there's a kind of a little rivalry going on there. And some things are just kind of crazy, like the world's largest prairie dog on Interstate 70 in Kansas. I've been there. It's not very impressive, but when you're on Interstate 70 and driving through Kansas, it's actually a welcome relief. If you've ever done that, you know it's pretty empty out there. One of our own local crazy things, and I didn't write about this in the book, is the beaver storage in Lee again. And it's clearly an advertising, come on. Doesn't look much like a beaver to me, actually. It looks kind of like a gopher with steroid problem or something of that nature. I don't know. But it's clearly a come on. It's clearly an advertisement. The milk bottle on the Whately is a little bit different. We can talk about the rise and decline of dairy farming through that milk bottle, particularly in Whately. The same thing in Gardner, which is in chapter 30 of my book, about the giant chair, which talks about, about the time in which Massachusetts was the industrial leader of the United States, and by itself is one of the industrial leaders of the entire world. But I wanted to concentrate on Western Mass because Boston dominates the Commonwealth. And you can see the skyline of Boston. For us, the skyline out here is the UMass campus. Right? That's about the only place that we see anything that approaches high rises. Several publishers that I talked to about this book before I went to Leveler's Press said, "Oh yeah, this is a great idea, Rob. We'd love to publish your book if you include some stuff about Boston." Well, if you're a Western Mass guy, that's a big insult, actually. And we don't need another book about Boston. So I was lucky that finally Leveler's Press wanted to do this just about Western Mass. The picture that you see here of the campus with the was taken a couple of years ago when I helped organize a conference at UMass, and this is taken from the top of the campus center. And a lot of my friends, academic friends from Boston, came out here. First time they'd ever been in Western Mass. And they were surprised by the UMass campus. And they didn't quite say it, but I got the sense that a lot of them felt like maybe we walked around barefoot on dirt roads out here in the wilderness of Western Mass. Well, that kind of bemusing thing can easily give way to feeling slighted, to feeling insulted. Now, the flashing lights there you see is the big dig system. And I remember being here when the big dig was taking place, and every time there was a pothole that wasn't filled in Amherst or Northampton, people started grumbling, "Oh, yeah, our tax dollars are going to Boston," and so forth and so on. There's some reasons for that. I'll get to it in just a second here, but there have been some actual insults. Remember when UMass basketball was #1 in the nation? I think we finished #2 that year. Dan Shaughnessy, sports writer for Boston Globe, was astounded by that, and he referred to our Commonwealth flagship campus as, and I'm quoting him exactly here, UMass Hooterville, an old TV show, Petticoat Junction. Mitt Romney, and here you see him having been elected governor of Massachusetts, and most people think he was an okay governor. And I remember Mitt being an okay governor and so forth. But I also remember that when Mitt Romney ran for the US Senate against Ted Kennedy in 1994, he flunked his geography test. He said that he wanted to be the senator for the entire state of Massachusetts, and he intended to canvass the entire state, quote, "from Boston to Worcester." Okay, I think he might have gotten like 11 votes out here at that, so because of that little overlook, if you will. We have to ask ourselves, why is the capital in Boston? Okay, and why is this power tip so much to the eastern part of the state? Historic reasons. Here was part of the historic Society of Amherst and so forth. Well, it made sense. In 1776, Boston was the second largest city in the nation. And the thing I want to point out to you is that 11 of the 39 largest cities in the United States were in Massachusetts. Okay, the westernmost of which was Andover. And you can see that of the entire population of Massachusetts at the time, and that included the territory of Maine, which was part of Massachusetts then, almost all of it was inside what today is Route 128 or Interstate 95. And you see, our big cities were not so big in 1776. And it remains that way, that Boston really is, I mean, to give Boston its due, 70% of the population of the Commonwealth lives inside Route 128. So the Boston metropolitan area is by nature going to be consuming the bulk of the resources here in the Commonwealth. Boston has always been trade and commerce, and Western Mass has always been natural resources, pretty much, and farming until very, very recently. However, this is an interesting chart to look at. Populations were on the move in the early 19th century for various reasons. Population growth, but basically looking for better farmland. Anybody who's dug up their backyard knows that a lot of the soil around here consists of very large stones. But also new lands were acquired, Western expansion, and then the unfortunate part here is removal of Native Americans. So state by state, places began moving their capitals further west. I grew up in Pennsylvania, the capital is Harrisburg. If you grew up in New York, capital is Albany. It's not one of the boroughs of New York. You see the 13 original states 10 of them moved their capital. New Jersey, it was always Trenton because it was on the Delaware River and they had a thriving pottery industry. You can eliminate Rhode Island because the entire state is seaboard, and Massachusetts stayed in Boston. Okay, now you could say that that's maybe logical, but in 35 of the 50 states, the capital is not the largest city. In fact, in 12 states, yeah, the capital is in a place that has fewer than 50,000 residents. Montpelier is the smallest in the country, Montpelier, Vermont. There have been periodic discussions about maybe the capital should be in Worcester or perhaps Springfield. That never happened. Right? So you add it all up. And the first thing I noticed when I came to Western Mass, and I've been here since 1985, okay, is that people out here love Boston sports teams, but they basically dislike everything else about Boston. Now, for the record, I don't hate Boston at all, but there is a sense, and it's palpable, it's real, that Boston dominates the Commonwealth, and we are kind of an afterthought out here. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And what I wanted to do in the book is I wanted to recover some of the stories. I wanted to recover some of the history out here. There's that fountain again on the Amherst Green. And just for kicks, here's the Strong House Museum in 1916, roughly 1916, before it became the center for the Amherst Historical Society. Okay. So to do local history, here's your cheat sheet. And it's a good one. If you want to do a local history project, start by talking to people. That's one of the great things about this book, is getting to talk to so many people. Now, don't take what they give you as gospel truth. You should be skeptical of some of the stuff that you see, not cynical, but skeptical. And you absolutely need to brainstorm other possibilities of what might be there. And after that, then you start doing your homework. You start looking for visual clues. You start looking at context. And by context, I mean the history of when this thing first happened. And then you look for the paper trail, old newspaper articles, letters, archival material, moldy history books in the Jones Library that people haven't taken off the shelf in decades. You put it all together and then you play Sherlock Holmes and you say, okay, what does inductive reasoning tell me? Once again, here's that place, that green, and you can see the little box there on the green. That's where that fountain is today. It's under that little box. It's part of a redevelopment plan. We'll get into that a little bit later. And by the way, about the Amherst Green is a fake. It isn't real. I write about greens in the book, town greens in the book. And you can see that it took place in the 1870s and it was once a frog pond and all of that. And that helps us actually nail down when the fountain was built. And we know what it was. Okay, we know what it was. And this gives us a clue probably when it was built, because there it is again. And we see both an automobile and we see a horse and buggy. So it indicates to us it was probably late 19th century would be my guess, perhaps early 20th century, but certainly in the age before automobiles began to dominate. What it was a fountain put up by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Okay. And I want to talk a little bit about the WCTU today, which is a misunderstood organization, because this is a case where we know the end of the story. We know that the 18th Amendment went into place, went into effect in 1920, passed in 1919, went into effect in 1920. And look at what the visual clue shows you here. Look at how that American issue thing is just matter of fact, screaming headlines, US is voted dry. And then look what happens to those headlines and papers once it's repealed in 1933. It's basically party time, folks, and everybody is happy and all of that. Visual clues also tell us what something we think we know. We think that the temperance people were all a bunch of prudes, and this is basically the poster woman for bad behavior of the temperance movement. This is Carrie Nation, who in 1894 in her native Kansas took her little hatchet and smashed a bar, and then that got such newspaper press at the time. She did it again, and she spawned imitators. You can see her nickname there, Hatchet Granny, and all of that. Well, so we think that temperance advocates were kind of a bunch of spoil sports, basically. It's not that simple. One of the things that we have to do is we have to start with some definitions, and I'm not going to read these to you. You can read them for yourself, but I do want to point out that when you talk about anti-alcohol movements, abstinence could be voluntary. It was actually for most of the 19th century, the choice to not consume alcohol. Prohibition, however, was mass. If you were a prohibition advocate, which is what Carrie Nation was, you wanted a legal constitutional amendment. You wanted laws to make sure that nobody could drink or sell or distribute alcohol. Temperance, however, look at that. Moderation and control. That is a form of self-improvement, at least in theory. Now, actual temperance advocates were kind of, they were on, you kind of need to think of this as a sliding scale. And temperance advocates could be anywhere on this sliding scale. Again, we have to ask the why question, though. Why were so many people opposed to drinking? I'll tell you in a moment here about how many people did that. Okay. Well, some were prudes, some were really spoil sports, but most of the people viewed themselves as social redeemers. And that's important to remember. Because official clues again tell us that they sure did have a lot of followers here in Western Massachusetts. Here are some other temperance fountains: Holyoke, Westfield, Orange, and the one in Lee, which I'll be talking about. Apparently, there was also one in Hadley and Conway. And it wasn't just the Boondocks, Washington, D.C., New York City, temperance fountains there. I wish I could, as I said, talk more about the one in Amherst, but we can't see it, so I didn't write about it. This one in Lee, however, is a really good one. Now, to see it, if you've not looked at it before, what you do is you get off the Turnpike exit at Lee, and instead of heading for the outlet malls or going on to Stockbridge, you turn into the town of Lee. And basically where Park Street turns into Main, there's a small green there, and you'll see the fountain there, which bears the name of Jeanette Kilbon, which is actually spelled incorrectly on the on the monument a little bit. It's not Kilborn, by the way, it is Kilbon. But she lived there, and it was carved, though it's a kind of a humble thing, it was carved by a very, very famous sculptor, Daniel Chester French. If that name doesn't, if it rings bells, but you're not quite placing it, he was probably the most famous marble sculptor of his day. And you do know the Lincoln Memorial, and you probably know there's a statue that was later cast in bronze. It's of the Minuteman, which is the way most people think of the Minuteman in Concord. And you can visit his studio in Stockbridge, which is called Chesterwood's, really worth a visit. Now, the fountain has actually three purposes. I'll start with Chief Conkapot there. That's the name there. And you can see that it was actually put up in 1899. If you like puns, and I love them, you could make some puns out of this. A pod is actually 1/2 pint, imperial pint of beer, and getting conked used to be a synonym for getting drunk. In this case, however, there really was a Chief Conkapot. He was a sachem, a Mohican sachem, which means a principal chief. And he was part of the group that sold land to English settlers that led to the development of towns in the Berkshires in 1724. There was nothing untoward about this. It was actually a very reasonable deal for the time and all that. So Chief Conkalpat was a real person. The fish on the other side here tells you something about the second purpose. The second purpose was, it's hard to know what kind of fish Daniel Chester French had in mind here, but it was supposed to represent the Housatonic River. And the statue the fountain, excuse me, didn't actually originally sit where it does today off of Park Street. It was originally down by Railroad Street, which is where you actually cross the Housatonic River if you're driving out of town on Route 7. So that's the second purpose, but the major purpose is to honor Amelia Jeanette Kilbon. And you can see she didn't live very long. She died at the age of 27. And one of the reasons I decided to write about this is because I kind of was instantly enamored with her photograph, and I saw it in the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College. There's I don't know, there's just a sweetness to that picture that made me want to know more about her. So I looked into her biography, and obviously it's a rather short one. Was born on the 4th of July. Her parents, her father was a banker and all that, and they were comfortable. They were not filthy rich or anything like that. They were all members of the, what else at this period of time, a congregational church. Amelia was active in the church. In fact, when she was still in high school, she got interested in temperance. Her brother became a minister and all that. She went to Smith and graduated with straight C's, not really interested in doing much on the campus. I will warn you, however, about that straight C thing. For reasons that they're not even sure about at Smith, at the time she was there, D was the highest grade, and A meant barely passing. So at some point that flip-flop, and I'm still trying to track down exactly when that happened. But she didn't make waves on campus. It was in Lee where she made waves. She came back and she got involved with children's education, and she was involved in something called the Loyal Temperance Legion, which was actually the youth component of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So you can see that she was involved with children ages 6 to 12, particularly doing art projects, to basically telling children that drinking is not a good thing. Noted for being just a really nice person, fondly remembered there before she died of consumption. That's the old name for tuberculosis in 1897. She's a reminder that we need to go beyond prudery as well. Now, I want to talk now a little bit about temperance as an idea in American society, and it's an old one. One of the founders of the nation, Dr. Benjamin Rush, was opposed to alcohol, but Lyman Beecher, whose picture you see there with his Napoleon-like with his arm sticking in his jacket, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, probably the most famous minister of the late 19th century. He was the founder of the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, the very first large temperance group in the United States. What were they about? Well, here you can find an awful lot, going back to the visual clues, of artwork like the one that you see here. It was called The Drunkard's Progress, a little take on the Pilgrim's Progress and so forth. And I won't go through this step by step, but you can see it starts with a glass of alcohol with a friend. And by the time you get to step 5, where you're drinking all the time, it's basically debauchery, and then downhill from there. Poverty, disease, all your friends leave you. You're desperate to turn to crime, and finally you kill yourself. That's sort of the idea behind this. And there's a lot of stuff like that. Well, the temperance advocates saw themselves as having an idea, having a plan to prevent that kind of tragedy. And it is almost impossible to exaggerate how much Americans drank. If you read a book by William Roarball, he called the United States an alcoholic republic. That's also the name of his book. A lot of people agreed with him. I mean, a lot of people were alarmed by this in this time period. The American Temperance Society had 1.5 million members by 1835. That's out of a population of just over 4 million. Wouldn't know this by going on the campus on a Saturday night, but Amherst College had 3 temperance groups, 3, and 3/4 of their students took a temperance pledge. And you can see one of the temperance pledges over here. That's what that document is. You would sign this formal document. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they gave up alcohol. It meant that they were being temperate, okay? That they wanted to moderate their intake of alcohol, not allow yourself to develop any kind of dependency on it, and certainly never be drunk in public or become an alcoholic. So this whole idea of redeeming people, redeeming individuals, here's another thing that happened a lot in American society. From time to time, we would have these upsurges in religious revivals, Christian almost always revivals. The Second Great Awakening hit between 1834 and 45. The first, by the way, was the one with which we associate Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was all about sin. The second one was about changing yourself, changing your own heart and all that. Millions of people convert. You get new temperance groups. The Father Matthews Society, by the way, it's about the time that Irish immigrants are coming in. That movement came over from Ireland. It was a way for the Irish to try to counter their bad reputation. Massachusetts, you could have gone to a local newsstand in Amherst. Massachusetts had 60 temperance journals. And it's not something we talk about, but there were 5 times more temperance societies than there were anti-slavery movements in pre-Civil War America. And you see, we would particularly love those temperance movements here in Massachusetts and in New England in general. A bestseller from the 19th century. Doesn't stop at the Civil War. Okay? In 1854, Timothy Shea Arthur wrote a book called 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. The book, you can, visual clues on the cover of the book are fantastic. You see a woman, you'd have to read the book. It's kind of amusing to know if that's his sister or a relative or a wife, trying to pull a man away from a bar. And you can see he's looking over at the debauchery going on behind him. He's not looking at her. The tale is pretty much like that Drunkard's Progress thing I just showed you. Well, sounds amusing. 3rd best-selling novel of the 19th century, trailed only Ben-Hur and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay? So this is a very popular book. Women particularly read this kind of stuff, and women particularly were involved in temperance movements because women suffered much more than men from it. I don't want to belittle the disease of alcoholism and so forth, but very few women at the time worked outside the home, so they didn't have any kind of independent income, had only what their husbands gave them, and they, of course, lost income. Children suffered from alcoholism, and what you see going on there is absolutely true. The domestic violence rates were off the chart during the late 19th century. Divorce was rare, middle and late 19th century. Divorce was still rare, but abandonment was not, and neither was domestic abuse. That was not rare. So women particularly became crusaders for the temperance movement. And as they did, over time, you see a shift from basically being self-control to calls for prohibition. Now, we don't like to talk about this too much because it's, I won't say we don't like to talk about it, we don't realize it, that a lot of states went dry long before the 18th Amendment was put into place. Maine went dry in 1851. By that time, it's in its own state. Massachusetts briefly went dry in 1852. 13 states went dry before the Civil War. Most were repealed, and that just got people thinking, well, we need laws to protect this because people are not being not engaging in self-control. Right? So the second and third waves of temperance, the later waves, if you will, take place, and they do shift towards prohibition. Okay? You can see again some of the visual clues. If we just get rid of alcoholic drink, we can get rid of everything: murder, riots, insanity, ruin homes, all those kinds of things. We also get new groups: the Anti-Saloon League, that was the group that Carrie Nation was part of, Catholic Total Abstinence Society, and so forth, so on, and the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Right? As you can see from the slide, that was formed in 1874. It grew under its second leader, Frances Willard, second president of the W.C.T.U. The dates you see there are her birth and death date, not when she was president of the W.C.T.U. She was an interesting woman in so many levels. She had a do-it-all philosophy in which she wanted basically to reform American society on everything. And you can see that the top ones there are pretty good. Peace is a good idea. Not having gambling problems is a good idea, and so forth. The ones that are in yellow are the more controversial ones. Americanization programs at that period of time basically meant converting immigrants to Anglo-Saxons. Anti-premarital sex, that one is one that they just totally lost. Sunday blue laws, all sorts. So kind of controversial, and they lost that one eventually. They were publicly anti-gay, and that one's kind of an interesting one, because Frances Willard was most certainly a lesbian, and one of her partners might have been her brother's wife, Mary Bannister Willard. So she didn't practice what she preached on that one, but she was a really interesting woman on so many levels, and a really intriguing figure, a great reformer of the 19th century. Well, what do water fountains have to do with it? Glad you asked that question. If you're going to get rid of booze, what are people going to drink? And that led to the cold water movement. You had to figure out something else for people to do. With socialize, coffee houses were part of that, but water people thought might be even better. Now, if you go broad, you might notice something that's missing, that's just everywhere in America. That's to say, public drinking fountains. Well, the WCTU had something to do with that. Okay. They wanted people to drink water rather than alcohol. Good idea, sounds like. Had a problem. Okay. The problem with water is exactly why people were drinking a lot of alcohol, because water wasn't particularly safe in America. Okay. Most city water was not treated until well after 1902. 1902 is when we started doing it. There were no purity regulations at all until the progressive era, around 1914. And more to the point, there were no safe water fountains until after 1920. A man by the name of Benson came up with the water fountain that you see today that has a guard on it and so forth. Look at what it replaced. I should have actually put these slides the other way. There was cup. When it says replace the cup, they don't mean get rid of the cup. They mean that there was a cup in these drinking fountains, and you dipped it in the water, you drank your water, and then you put the cup back in. Whoa. Okay, can you say cholera, typhoid, dysentery, hepatitis? It was actually safer to drink alcohol than it was to drink water. It was also the point that I put this guy in here for fun, Dr. Henry Cogswell. He was a guy who designed and built more temperance fountains than anybody in America. And a lot of people thought they were ugly. There were actually a lot of vandalism about that. And he was kind of an odd duck himself, but yeah, he always put cranes on there, water bird, get it, okay, that kind of thing. Well, the water fountains might have been unsafe, but as you see, we did establish a Prohibition amendment that went into effect in 1920. And Massachusetts was the 11th state to ratify it. So we were up there again at the forefront of this. So let's point this out, that the Women's Christian Temperance Union was not a failed social movement, the way it often goes into history books. You can see it's also popular here again in New England, but it had 158,000 members by 1900. Look at its peak membership. Its peak membership comes during the time that Prohibition is still in effect. It has this white ribbon. You got a little white ribbon if you took the Temperance Pledge and all that. But if you think about what their goal was, and you look at some of those other things that were on that other chart, they weren't just a bunch of lunatics. They were people who put together a pretty successful social movement. It is the nature, by the way, of social movements that they eventually go out of business. In their case, they kind of went into decline because they had their greatest success and that lost people's attention. Well, this gets us back to Amherst here, okay? By the way, WCTU today only has about 6,000 members, so I say it lost interest, it really did. But who was the person who was the local Amelia Kilbon in Amherst? I mean, I don't know much about that fountain because I was doing research on other things, but who was the local person who was doing that kind of work? Well, that's your challenge. Who were the movers and shakers? Who funded it? Who put up the money? Is there, can we go to the Jones? Can we go to the Historical Society? Can we go to the UMass Library and find out information? Is it worth saving? And that's a question, because if you, I'll get back to that in just a second here. When we do this local history, don't think that you know the end of the story. Don't think that because that Prohibition went out of business and so forth, it was a bad idea. Okay? Don't associate anything which is today unpopular with something which has always been unpopular. Okay? And I'm going to ask you this question: why were there more temperance groups than there were abolitionist societies? Maybe you already know the answer to that. Well, I bring up needing to know the answers to this because I read this document from 2016. As you know, your common is being redesigned, and restoring the fountain is part of that redevelopment plan. Well, this 2016 redevelopment plan, it's only been starting to take place, and as you know, anybody who lives in a knows anything at all about local politics anywhere knows that when push comes to shove and projects start running low on money, they start looking for ways to cut things. So it would not be an unreasonable fear to think that maybe this would be one of the things that people would cut. Might be one of the things that people would cut. So people who are interested in local history might want to keep the pressure on about that sort of thing. Well, I'm going to give it over to you to talk about, to ask questions about here in just a second. I do want to point out that you can get my book, Who Knew, at Leveler's Press, which is right on right up the street, right across at Collective Copies in Amherst. Leveler's Press it's published in the back of that there and so forth. And it's 32 chapters, most of which are really short. My view here is that this is a kind of book that would be good to throw in a backpack or throw in the backseat of your car when you encounter one of those crazy things and you want to know about it. You just say, oh, let's see if Rob's had anything to say about that. And I highlight a few other things that are in there and so forth. If you can order it, it is on Amazon. I would encourage you not to buy it on Amazon because that doesn't keep any money in our community. And I don't think Jeff Bezos needs the money anymore. So if you do want to buy it and just have it mailed to you, I established something called a tiny URL. And you just need to type tinyurl.com/whoknewrob. And that will take you to Leveler's Press where you can buy it. I guess I should at this point say it makes a great gift for the holiday season, shouldn't I? And I'll stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to anybody who might have questions. And you can remind you to unmute if you have questions, raise your hand or whatever. And I guess, George, you're going to kick us off with a question or two. Is that correct?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Interesting about social movements and how they evolve. I read a fascinating book about Prohibition a few years back called Last Call.
Daniel Ockrant.
Okay,
Yeah.
didn't remember the author, but it talks about the social and cultural consequences of Prohibition, that since drinking alcohol became this, semi-illegal, risque thing to do, young people wanted to do it, but alcohol didn't taste very good. So you started mixing it with seltzers and fruit juices and syrups, and you invented the cocktail.
Mm-hmm.
And when people got together to drink in one location, what do you do besides drinking? Well, let's put on a floor show. Let's have some vaudeville. They invented the nightclub. Just fascinating, how Prohibition itself changed the United States.
Absolutely. Particularly, again, changed for women, stuff for women, because the tavern was a male preserve. And that, I think that Prohibition actually started to change that a little bit. We kind of went from bar rooms to taverns, actually, if you think about the subtlety of the difference between that and so forth. Yeah.
Saloons were not nice places to be back before Prohibition. Nice women did not go there.
No, they certainly did not. Yeah. I see a hand.
Elisa, is there a hand up?
Yeah. Yes, Elisa.
Speak.
Thanks. That was wonderful. I knew that the Christian Temperance Association was probably the progressives of the time. Certainly that domestic violence and things like that were real issues and needed to be dealt with. But so this was wonderful, but I couldn't help but relate to the Gardner chair.
I forgot.
Gardner has the chair. Is it Winchendon that has the big rocking horse?
That is right. I didn't write about that, but I think if there's a volume 2, I think I will write about the rocking horse.
Still things to write
It
about.
was Toy City. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there another hand up?
Hey, Rob, I didn't have my hand up, but I got a question for you anyway.
Then we'll have to get back to yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I didn't know if you're aware there's a nice temperance fountain down in the middle of Holyoke, Mass. It's right down in the corner. Yeah, right down in the corner of Dwight and High Streets, right in front of the town hall down there.
Yep.
I don't know if you wrote about it in your book, but maybe you could add that in volume 2.
Yep.
Well maintained.
I wrote only about the one in Lee for that, and just noted where there were others in the chapter, because I was trying to focus on community by community when I could. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's something you could keep in mind anyway for future books.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you.
Okay.
I think.
Any final questions? By the way, I posted the URL for if anybody wants to get it by mail. I posted it incorrectly at first, so if you look in your chats thing, it says tinyurl.com. Who knew, Rob? So, and I don't think there's a space between tiny and URL either, so I typed it incorrectly twice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for your talk, and.
And maybe the 4 of us will get together again sometime this winter. Who knows?